Greetings. Welcome to the Yang Style Long Form course. I'm Michael Gilman. This is the second in our series in reference tapes for the long form that are breaking down the structural components so that we can master the form, and doing it looking very carefully at each movement, doing it in sequence so that you can be practicing along with me, and we'll be examining all the various aspects of what this is important in the structure. The first in this series, we concentrated on the feet. The feet are in touch with the ground, and we referred to it as gathering to the inside and releasing from the outside. This particular class will be focusing on what we call the qua, or the hips, and how the hips open and close with each movement. Now, I need to explain part of it. There's a little bit of a problem with terminology, because sometimes this is called opening and closing of the hips. Sometimes it's called gathering and releasing, or contracting and expanding. And all of it has to do with the hips moving in their socket, in the hip socket, and turning, so that if we look again sort of at the structure of the body, when we were talking about moving to the inside of the hip, when we moved to the inside, there was this screwing up of the energy into the hip, what we called gathering, that the energy was being compressed between the hip joint and the floor. Then, when we move forward, we press from the outside of the heel, that the energy turned the other way, or what we call screwing out into the ground. And as we screw it out into the ground, these hips open, like so. Now, it takes some practice, and that's why we're going to spend this hour looking and going through the movements and examining this open and close, gather, release, expand and contract, because it's an essential component for the structure of moving and supporting energy. Remember that the energy comes up from the ground into the legs, compressed into the legs. The hips are like the sort of a transmission of where this energy is going to be put and how it's going to come out of the body. And so it's very important that we have this feeling. If you could look inside, the hips, when we're gathering, there's this sort of a roundness in a way. That's sort of a simplification, but so there's an expansion in the back. There's an opening in the back. When we move forward, all of this is pressing inward to support the energy that moves out. The buttocks slightly tucks under. The buttocks slightly tightens. The low back firms, and the hips open. Now, I use the analogy, for instance, if you were shooting a gun, the reason why the lead goes flying out when you pull the trigger, the reason why the lead goes out is because there's nowhere else for the casing, the shell, to go. It's pressed up against your shoulder. You know, and there's a great deal, like if you were to shoot a gun, in a big caliber, there's a huge recoil this direction. But because you've got your body there, the bullet goes forward. If you were to lay just the bullet, we'll say, on the ground, and you were to somehow set it off, the casing would go that way and the bullet would go that way, but not very far. You need to have, if you're going to release energy, you need to have support for the energy to spring forward. And that's what we use. The hips, the back, all firm up. When the energy is moving out, the buttock slightly tucks under, and there's a firmness back here to support the energy going in the direction that you want. So it's a very important concept. And so all of these things, all of the energy movement of the body is dependent on your having intention about what you want to be doing. Do you want to be pushing something away? Do you want to be pulling something? Do you want to be splitting something apart? Do you want to push it down, lift it up, twist it? Whatever it is, that is going to determine the structure of the body. The structure of the body, it doesn't come first. Your intention comes first. What do you want to do? Then the body will respond. And when the body is trained completely, for instance, like a baseball player, they don't have to, it's like they know where they want to hit the ball. They're focusing on, okay, I'm going to hit the ball over here. Because they're trained, they can hit the ball a lot of the time and send it where it wants to go. You don't have to think about how to set the structure of the body once it's trained. It will just respond automatically. You think grab something, you grab it. You don't have to think, okay, energy to the shoulder, energy here, and grab it. Okay? So the intention is first. What do you want to do? And then the structure is going to support that movement. So in this case, the opening and closing, what we can call gather and release. Now, the term release means if we were using Tai Chi as a martial art, we would want to be releasing our energy into the other person. For instance, if I was hitting something, I want the energy to go into the object. For instance, if I was hitting a ball, I was a baseball player, I don't want the energy in the bat. I want the energy to go from the bat to the ball so the ball goes away. Okay? When we're thinking about the martial aspects of Tai Chi, we are thinking about gathering and releasing. If we're thinking about the health aspects, the release, we don't really release. We expand and we contract. The energy presses inside and the energy then moves to the center. It's like a pulse. And in some way, in the martial aspects, it does it somewhat, but there is an element of releasing. So when I'm calling out the terms of, I'm going to say gather, because we want the energy to be moving to the hip. Then I'm going to say release, meaning that it's releasing from the hip joint to some place in the body or foot or wherever it is. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's going out of the body. It just means it's coming out of the hip. Okay? So gather is the hips are what I would call closing or moving towards, rotating towards the front. Releasing is energy, is the hips are opening, the front is getting bigger and the back is getting smaller. In gathering, the back is bigger and the front is smaller. Okay, so gather and release. And it has the same thing, there's a slight tilting going on in the pelvis. When the gather, if I were to exaggerate this, the gather, we would say the hip swings backward. Release, the buttocks tucks under, like so. So it could be, there's a slight swinging to the hips for gather. For gather, there's a relaxation, a natural sway to the back. Release is the buttocks tucks under more, so that it gives more support for the energy to go out. Okay, so again, once you practice, get into practicing this, at some point it becomes natural. And you don't have to think about it. Just like with the feet, inside and outside the foot should be natural. But that's why we're taking the time to examine each movement, to practice it opening and closing by itself. Okay? So everything works together. The inside and the outside of the foot works with the closing and opening of the hips. They both are going to work together. When we gather, we're also moving to the inside of the foot. When we're releasing, the hips open and the energy is moving from the outside of the foot. It's just natural, but a lot of times we don't do things naturally. And in Taiji, we need to, look at each one of these elements, break it up, and then we'll put it all together again at the end. Okay? So we're going to go through the movements, and we're going to not concern ourselves with flow. Flow is one of the most important aspects of Tai Chi practice, but I'm going to be calling out the names of the movements, calling out whether it's gather or release, and it takes time, and sometimes it's, I can't focus on the flow. I'm focusing on this aspect. Okay, so we're not going to worry about the continuity. We want to concern ourselves with, is the structure working right for us? Now, one last element of this gather and release bit is there's always every time you're moving the weight, there's the gathering and releasing going on. But I'm only it would be terribly confusing to try and talk about every little bit that happens in every movement. I'm only going to talk about the major movement, the major gather and release before the end of the movement. So you'll see what I mean when we go through it. But I'm not going to call out everything, but only the ones that are important for each movement, the major ones that are important for each movement. Okay? Now, the gather phase, the major gather phase, happens when we are stepping. For instance, when we're doing movements, transitioning and things like that, I'm only going to mention the major one is when you're stepping. That is when you're committed, your energy is committed. When you step, that means you've set the situation up for your release. The release happens instantaneously on the step. It doesn't happen before you step, generally speaking. The gather happens just before the step, the release happens after the foot has stepped down. And you'll see that happen. So please notice that the gather happens with the stepping and the release happens after the foot is placed down. Okay, so I think that's enough explanation, and we're just going to take our time. We'll go through and we'll see, we'll go through from the back, and we'll talk about it so that you can practice along with us, and if we have time, we'll flow through it from the front so you can see some of the hand movements. But by now, I think that we've seen the hand movements by now, so let's think about the hips. Let's work on the hips, gather and release. All right, so here we go. I'm going to start out a little bit over here. So to start with, we are in what we call Wu Chi stance, a nice, easy, balanced stance. The gather, don't forget, the gather phase is the yin phase, and the release phase is the yang phase. So that's another element to add in. Okay, so Wu Chi is balanced, no yin or yang, it's balanced. Now, commencement of Tai Chi Chuan. We start with the yin phase or gather. The hips start to my hips are sort of rotating in a little bit as the energy drops to the center. Then we come up and open. Here, as I come up and the hands expand for Pong, the hips are actually rotating out. The buttocks is tucking slightly under. Then gather, release for the G element, gather, going into the on element, and release so the energy is pressing down. Okay, that's commencement of Tai Chi. Ward off left. So, like for instance, here we might be gathering, but we're not going to look at that yet. We're not going to concern ourselves with the first phase. Here, as we step, we gather. The hips are closing. The energies move to the inside of the foot. Then, releasing, the hips open, the buttock slightly tucks under. There's a straightening of the back. The chi is coming from the outside of the foot, and this is a firmness, what we call expansion. Yang. From now on, we'll be just calling this structure release. All those elements. Then gather. Here, there's a softening, a chi. The energy is moving back to the inside of the foot, moving more towards the lower dantian. There's a relaxation, a condensation into the center. We step. Now we release. Open, energy moves from the heel. We're opening, we're firm, yang. Roll back, energy moves inward, what we call gather. G press is release. Hips open, heat energy coming from the heel, body firm. On. First we gather, inside of the back foot, hips closing. And here release, energy moves from the heel, buttock slightly tucks under, firmness, expansion. It's not tight, but inside there's a feeling of expansion, like my skin is a little too tight. If I were using this as a martial art, the energy would be flowing out of the body, sort of like a vapor, like a spray of energy. But since we're just practicing for our own health, it's just filling the body, all the way, particularly to the palms. Okay, so here we relax. The energy moves back to the center. Single whip. Okay, now we focus on gathering into the right leg and releasing, opening, firming, firm. Raise hands. Here we gather left and release. Stork spreads its wings. Gather. Release. Left brush knee. Gather. Release. Play the fiddle. Gather to the right foot. Release. Even these ones where I'm standing on, for instance, for this foot, for this energy, we come in. The chi shifts to the inside of the right foot. The hips are basically closed here. Then what's going to happen is the hips are going to open. The chi is going to come up from the heel as this happens. The buttocks tucks on. It's like if I was exaggerating. This firms up the chi to move outward. So it's all going to happen inside, but that's what's going to happen. When we stand on one foot, it's still chi coming up from the back heel, gathering and releasing. Okay, left brush knee. Gather. Release. Now we could say we gather in the back foot and release the front foot, but since I said we're only going to look at the major one, so here we're going to gather to the left foot, gather with the step, then release. Left brush knee, gather, release. Play the fiddle. Once again, this time we gather the right foot, and even though the weight stays on it, the release happens on the back foot. Then, left brush knee, gather, release. Step up, parry, and punch. Sometimes in the same movement we're going to have two gather and releases. For instance, here's gather to the left foot and release. Then I immediately gather into the right foot and release. Okay, then relaxing, we gather into the right leg and release. Cross hands. Here we gather. In this case, actually we're going to gather to the right, to the left leg. It could be either both legs or to the left, a little bit more to the left, and we release. Energy opens and comes upward. Good. Then carry tiger to mountain. We gather as we step and release. Grasping the bird's tail. Grasping the bird's tail consists of roll back, press forward, and push, and sometimes right push upward. So we'll call it all grasping the bird's tail, so I don't have to call out each movement. Here's gather, release, gather, release. Now, fist under elbow, which is next, is a very complex movement. There's a lot of possibilities for gathering and releasing, but we'll just look at the major one at the end. So all this, we can use the first part as a transition kind of part. It can have a lot of elements of gathering and releasing, but we'll just say, we'll look at the very last part. So here, we're gathering into the right hip and releasing forward. Step back and repulse monkey. Gathering into the right hip and opening, releasing. It's a little trickier when stepping back. Gather into the left hip and release. Gather into the right hip and release. Slanting flying. Gather left, release. Raise hands. Gather left, release. Stork spreads its wings. We'll say gather left for the moment. Release. Now here's one that very quickly we have to gather into the right and then release, because there's two parts to this movement. Release. Left brush knee. Gather left, right, gather right, release. Needle at C bottom. This is a little trickier because we're stepping up and we're going to bend forward. It's going to feel kind of strange, but still we've gathered the chi and it's going to come out and release as we come down. It's going to be a little tricky for you to feel that, but if you think about as the body's coming over, there's a pouring. The energy's going to be squeezed from the hip out and down. So we'll call it release. It's still, the hip is still opening. Even though the body's bending, it's still, the hip's still opening. The chi is coming up from the back of the foot. Release. Fan through the back. Gather right. Release. Turn and chop opponent with fist. Gather, left, and release. Step up, deflect downward, and punch. So there's different possibilities here, but we'll say again, gather right and release. Ward off left, gather right, release. Grasping the bird's tail. Gather left, release. Gather, release. Gather, release. Single whip. Gather, release. Waving hands like clouds. This one feels really good when you think about gathering, releasing. So hip, even though the body is twisted in a funny, different way, here this release, the hips are opening, the chi is coming from the heel, even though the foot is at a strange angle in relation to the other foot. But there's still, you can have that very good, solid release from the heel. Then immediately we relax. Then gather to the inside of the foot, the hips close, release, the hips open, energy comes from the heel. Then immediately there's a relaxation. Gather. Release. Relaxation. Gather, release. Now single whip, gather left, release. Now immediately you gather into the right and release. High pat on horse. As we step, we gather to the right and release. Separation of the right foot kick. Now, in the separation kicks, on the toe kicks, we gather into the supporting foot. For instance, I'm gathering into the right foot, left foot, so that when the kick is going to come from, more or less from this hip. Separation of the right foot kick. The little transition here. So again, gather to, this time separation of the left foot kick. It's a separation kick, so it's going to come from this hip. This hip. Now, the kick downward with sole. When I think about gathering, I'm going to gather into the kicking, I'm going to gather into this hip so that it's like this hip is gathering the chi and it just expands outward and then comes back. So on all the sole kicks, you gather to this hip and then come back. Now, as I do brush knee, move into gathering into the right foot and releasing. Step up and right brush knee, gather to the left and open. Step up and punch downward. Gather to the right hip and release. Again, it's interesting, when the body's moving down, still the hips are opening more. The chi is coming from the heel, the hip is rotating outward. Now, one thing I didn't say, be careful in the gathering phase that you don't let the knee collapse. There's a tendency sometimes when you gather to do this, to let this collapse. No. Make sure the knee always goes in the direction of the toe. Even though I'm moving to the inside of the foot, this knee is still staying out. Don't let this collapse or you'll find yourself in trouble. Okay, punch downward. Turn and chop opponent with fist. Gather left. Now this little bit, this chop motion could have a lot of support to it, but it's sort of more transition-y. It's a light thing, so we're not really releasing here, but now the big power is coming, so the hip opens and the power comes out. Okay. Then, gather to the right foot, and this is step up, deflect downward. The first part of this is a releasing forward, then relaxing. Gather to the right foot and punch. Okay, right foot kick with sole. So now these sole kicks, again, as I remind you, that the supporting foot is going to stay. The energy is going to move to this hip, and we're going to then press it out and gather it back in. Right foot kick with sole. Hit a tiger. Gather to the right and release. Hit a tiger at right. Gather to the left hip and release. Right foot kick with sole. Now again, it's a sole kick, so we're going to gather to the right hip, release. Strike opponent's ears with both fists. Gather to the left and release. Left foot kick with sole. Gather to the left hip and release. Turn and right foot kick with sole, right hip, release. Step up, parry and punch. Gather to the right hip, release. Withdraw and push. Gather to the right hip and release. Cross hands. This time, for this cross hands, we're going to gather a little bit more to the right hip and release more from the right hip so that we can easily turn in the left. Then we immediately gather into the left hip and release. Grasping the bird's tail, gather, release. Gather, release. Okay. Diagonal single whip. Gather right, release. Partition of the wild horse's mane. Gather left, release. Gather right, release. Gather left, release. Ward off left. Gather right, release. Grasping the bird's tail. Gather left, release. Gather left, release. Gather, release. Single whip. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Fair lady works at shuttles. Gather right, release. Gather left, release. Gather right, release. Gather left, release. Ward off left. Gather right, release. Grasping the bird's tail. Gather left, release. Gather, release. Gather, release. Single whip. gather right, release. Waving hands like clouds. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Single whip. Gather left, release. Gather right, release. Snake creeps down. So here we're going to gather into the right hip and release it forward. Then, golden pheasant. In this case, we're going to gather to the left and release. Gather to the right, release. Step back and repulse monkey. Gather right, release. First part here, we're just kind of strengthening the body, no releasing. But here, gather left, release. Gather right, release. Slanting flying. Gather left, release. Raise hands. Gather left, release. Stork spreads its wings. Gather left, release. Gather right, release. Left brush knee. Gather right, release. Needle at C bottom. Gather right, release. Fan through the back. Gather right, release. Turn and white snake puts out tongue. Gather left, release. Step up, deflect downward, and punch. Gather right, release. Ward off left. Gather right, release. Grasping the bird's tail. Gather left, release. Gather, release. Gather, release. Single whip. Gather right, release. Waving hands like clouds. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Gather right, release. Single whip. Gather left, release. Gather right, release. High pat on horse, plain cross hands. Gather right, release. Turn and cross foot kick. This is basically gather to the left and release from the left. Release. Step up, deflect downward. Step up, parry and punch. Step up and punch downward. Step up and punch downward. Gather right. Release. It's so easy. It's so easy here to let this side collapse when punching. That's why it's very important, thinking about this release, thinking about this hip open, it really supports the structure and energy of this body. At this point, the buttocks are slightly tucked under, the hips are opening, even though the body is down at this angle. Ward off left. Gather right. Release. Grasping the bird's tail. Gather left. Release. Gather. Release. Gather. Release. Single whip. Gather right. Release. Snake creeps down. So here, we're not really going to release particularly from here. We're going to use this as a transition into step up to form 7 stars. So this is a little trickier. We're going to gather into the left foot, and from here, we're going to release forward from here. It's a little trickier. It just takes kind of a real sinking into this inside of this left foot, so that when you release, you press from the heel, and it's quite appropriate. Retreat to ride a tiger. Gather right. Release. Turn around and kick horizontally. So here we're going to gather into the left, and the kick is going to come really supported and strong from this left foot. Shoot a tiger with bow. Gather left. Release. Step up, deflect downward, and punch. Gather right. Release. Withdraw and push. Gather right. Release. Conclusion of Tai Chi Chuan. Okay, here we gather to both hips. And then we release, we move back into Wu Qi. We just sort of release the energy, feeling the body, and move back into a balanced yin-yang, what we call Wu Qi. Yeah. Okay, so that's a lot of work, isn't it? But how important, if you take the time to work on each one of these elements, one at a time. It's just so positive. So I really suggest you taking the time to do like stance practice, where you're in your bow and sit stance. And this is really a time to make sure, just without doing the movements, but just to make sure that the elements we've talked about so far are being accomplished, that you're doing the principles correctly. Then you apply the principles to the form. That's why in every class, we always start out working just really, really intensely on the stances and on this footwork before we do any movements or anything, very important. Okay? So, for instance, just to practice your getting into your bow and sit stance, we start in this Wu Chi, remember the shoulder width stance, and perfectly balanced, and then we turn out one foot, in this case it'll be my right, and feel when you turn out here and you come onto this foot, feel the weight, the relaxation into the inside of this foot. You really want to feel how, of course it's not just the inside of the foot, it's the whole foot, but mostly you feel the big toe and the inside arch as the supporting structure. Then step as far as you can without moving the body. Don't release yet. Now, what the problem with many Tai Chi practitioners is they start to release as they step. Now I've wasted a lot of my releasing energy. Can you see this? That here, when I'm gathering, now I've got 100% gathered. See? It's still all here. This is 100%, obviously, because it's all on one foot. Now, the heel is touching down. It's about 99%. Then it transfers and shifts. Now, what most people want to do is when they step, now if you're watching this hip, when I step, you see, now it's about 60% here and 40. I've wasted about 40% of my releasing energy, and then the rest goes forward. So I can't stress that enough for your Tai Chi enjoyment and proficiency, mastery of the form, to not step until you get your heel set. When you step, you gather, which means that there's more intention into this hip area. Then, when you release, you come from the heel. You want to feel your hips open, your hips open, the front of your body expanding, the back of your body contracting and supporting. The energy screwing in this leg, it's going clockwise. When I gather, it comes counterclockwise. When I release, it goes clockwise. You want to feel inside your body. You want to feel like something is blowing up. It's like, whoa, a balloon is blowing up. And when you move into the gather phase, it's like the pressure is being released and it moves back to the hip. So you have this feeling of expanding, opening, pressure inside, buttocks supporting this pressure so it goes in this direction. You're making the front bulge. And then when you gather, the front contracts, the back bulges. The back here is the energy sort of moving more to the back. And here, energy moving more towards the front. But of course, you're supporting it with firmness in the other direction. Yeah. So please, whether you're going straight forward or straight back, it's still the same. When you're coming backward, you're still gathering to the inside, releasing from the outside. This feeling of relaxation of softness, of yin, energy moving downward, of yang, energy moving outward. Hips open, yang, firmness, supporting the energy. Then the energy just starts to move backward and down. Yeah, okay. So that's really, really, really important. Okay, so as you're doing all these movements, you want to take the time and practice this. Then, when you put them into your form will be much, much more complete. And again, I just cannot tell you how important I think intention is in your working your Tai Chi forms. What do you want to do? That is going to determine whether your energy wants to move out or whether your energy wants to move in. How much support do you need for that part of the movement? Now, I talked about the ending of every, kind of the ending portion of every movement, but there's a lot of possibilities during portions of the movement depending upon your intention, okay? For instance, if I was doing step up, deflect downward, so here I'm gathering here and releasing. But in a lot of times what we do is we use this as a kick first, then we do this. So the gather would be to a different place. If I'm thinking about kicking, well, maybe my energy is going to be a different place. I have to gather, then releasing, then gather and releasing. But it all depends upon your intention, okay? So if you want to get clarified on your intention, we have the applications series, and on the website, gilmanstudio.com, all the movements are lined out with all the intentions so you can get clear on that, all right? Okay, so next week we're going to have a next session, next class, we're going to look at how the torso, so we looked at the foot, hips, next we're going to look at the torso and the intention for the torso as we go through on this reference series. So I hope that you enjoy this and do really think about it, all right? And even if you don't do Tai Chi and you do golf or tennis or whatever sport, walking, use it. Use the same thing, okay? All right, so thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.